George Harrison looked happy in front of the cameras, but behind closed doors, his life was much harder than people knew. There was one person in his life who caused him constant pain. This person, a fellow member of the Beatles, often tried to control everything George did musically. He didn't respect George's ideas, made fun of his spiritual beliefs, and treated him more like an assistant than an equal. For a long time, George stayed quiet. But in 1969, he couldn't take it anymore and stormed out of the studio in frustration. That moment was big, but it wasn't even the worst thing that happened. The real betrayal came later, during one of George's hardest times. What this person did crossed the line and damaged their friendship forever. George never truly forgave him and held on to that pain for the rest of his life. This is the story of the man George Harrison likely resented more than anyone else in his life. George was born on February 25, 1943, in a very small house at 12 Arnold Grove in Liverpool, England. That night, the city was under its 78th straight bombing attack during World War II. His father, Harold, worked long 14-hour days as a bus conductor and walked instead of riding the bus just to save money. He earned only £3 a week. George had to share a bed with his brothers until he was 16. His mother, Louise, cleaned offices at night and only made a few shillings for each building she cleaned. The entire family's food budget for the week was just 15 shillings. Even with so little, Louise did everything she could to make their home feel warm and hopeful. Everything changed for George in 1955 when he was 12 years old. While riding his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing from a house window. He stopped, completely taken by the sound. The guitar's echo and Elvis's voice amazed him. From that moment, he knew he wanted to play music. He ran home and told his mother that he needed a guitar more than food. His passion for music grew stronger every day after that. Finally, when he was 14, he got his first guitar. It was the beginning of a journey that would change music history forever. George Harrison saved up enough money and walked all the way to Frank Hess's music shop, where he bought a cheap Eggman flat-top guitar for 30 shillings. The guitar was hard to play. It hurt his fingers so much that they bled for weeks. But that didn't stop George. He practiced non-stop, sometimes for 6 to 8 hours a day. The first song he learned was Rock Island Line. As his passion for music grew, his interest in school faded. He failed nearly every subject except art. One of his teachers even wrote on his report card that George cared more about playing guitar than learning geometry. That same year, something life-changing happened. While riding the number 86 bus in Liverpool, George met a boy named Paul McCartney. Paul noticed George carrying his guitar and asked if he could play. George told him he knew how to play 20 Flight Rock, which was a tough song at the time. Paul was impressed by how well he played. Not long after that, George auditioned for Paul's band, the Quarrymen. At just one day shy of 15 years old, George played Raunchy perfectly. John Lennon wasn't sure about letting someone so young into the group, but George's talent was too obvious to ignore. He became the youngest member of the band that would later become the Beatles. George's family supported his musical dreams in ways most people wouldn't expect. His mother, Louise, took on a third job cleaning at the Cavern Club so she could help pay for George's music expenses. His father, Harold, secretly let him ride the bus for free, even though doing that could have cost him his job. When George needed a better guitar, the family sold their piano. For the band's first paid performance, Louise even pawned her wedding ring to help rent an amplifier. Every spare penny went toward supporting George's dream of becoming a musician. One key moment came during a show when Paul McCartney froze on stage and couldn't play his solo. The group realized they needed a real lead guitarist. Paul pushed hard for George to take on that role, but Lennon was unsure. George was still a kid. After some convincing, they held another audition, this time on the top of a double-decker bus parked outside Wilson Hall. George played Raunchy again, and that sealed the deal. Later research revealed that George had officially joined the band by December 7, 1957, even earlier than many believed. From the start, John Lennon treated George more like a younger sibling than an equal partner. The 3-year age difference felt huge at that time, and George's ideas were often overlooked. That tension kept building over the years. By 1969, during the stressful recording of the Let It Be album, George had enough. He confronted Lennon and then walked out of the studio. Lennon even suggested bringing in Eric Clapton as a replacement. George later admitted he felt pushed aside, especially after Yoko Ono became a big part of Lennon's life. When George first joined the Quarrymen, the band was already unstable. Many of the original members soon left, and the band kept changing its name, from Johnny and the Moondogs to JPEG 3, to Long John and the Silver Beatles, before finally becoming simply the Beatles in 1960. George's presence changed the group's sound. They moved from skiffle music to real rock and roll. He and Paul modified their guitars by adding pickups and used an Elpico amplifier, giving the band a new electric style. George's technical abilities played a big role in shaping the early Beatles sound. Then came Hamburg, Germany, which was a real test of their strength and endurance. In 1960, the Beatles got booked to play at the Kaiser Keller Club. They were on stage for up to 8 hours a day and had to stretch songs just to fill time. The club owner told them to perform like wild animals to excite the crowd. George was only 17. They lived in terrible conditions, behind the stage, in dirty rooms they shared with other bands. They barely slept. The club's bouncer was a former boxer who had killed someone in a fight. It was a tough environment, but it made them stronger and more professional. George continued playing in Hamburg and performed at the Star Club in 1962. There, he played in front of big crowds night after night and learned what it really meant to survive as a musician. Then came the big breakthrough. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles performed live on American television during the Ed Sullivan Show. Around 73 million people watched that night. More than 60% of all TVs in the US were tuned in. CBS received 50,000 ticket requests for that one show, but the studio only had room for 728 people. To understand how huge that was, compare it to Elvis Presley's first appearance in 1957, which brought in just 7,000 ticket requests. This performance changed everything, launching the Beatles into worldwide fame, and George was right there in the middle of it. That night on the Ed Sullivan Show, the Beatles gave a performance that would make television history. The broadcast reached the highest ratings Ed Sullivan had seen in 7 years, pulling in a 45.3 rating and a 60 share of the TV audience. Even the daughters of U.S. President Richard Nixon, Julie and Tricia, were in the crowd. The Beatles played 5 songs, All My Loving, Till There Was You, She Loves You, I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. As each member performed, their names appeared on the screen. When John Lennon's name popped up, the text under it read, "Sorry girls, he's married." That little note added to the charm, but what really mattered was the moment itself. It lit the spark for Beatlemania in the US and kicked off what became known as the British invasion. It wasn't just a great performance. It completely changed pop culture. A few months before that unforgettable night, George Harrison was already beginning to explore songwriting. It was August 1963, and he was stuck in bed with an illness while staying at the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth. A doctor had told him to rest and given him a tonic. Bored with nothing to do, George picked up a tape recorder and started messing around, just to see if he could come up with something. That little experiment turned into his first song, Don't Bother Me. In one surviving recording, you can even hear him working on the bridge and whistling the melody because the lyrics weren't finished yet. According to journalist Bill Harry, he had encouraged George to try writing, but George, feeling annoyed, had snapped back with the words, "Don't bother me." That phrase became the title. Later on, George admitted he didn't think the song was very good and wasn't even sure it counted as a real song. But it mattered to him because it proved he was capable of writing. He just needed more practice and confidence. That track eventually made it onto the Beatles' second album, with the Beatles, marking the first time George contributed a song to one of their records. Still, things didn't get much easier for him after that. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney were writing nearly every song for each album, George was usually limited to just 2 songs per record. That rule stayed in place from around 1965 onward, and over time, it created frustration that kept building. In 2022, Paul McCartney admitted that there had always been an unspoken agreement between him and John, that they would be the main songwriters. Paul said they never openly said, "Let's keep George out of it," but it was understood without words. George found it hard to get the rest of the band to take his songs seriously. Even their producer, George Martin, didn't give him the same respect he gave John and Paul. That only began to change toward the end of the Beatles' career. It wasn't until 1969 that Paul finally admitted George's songs were just as good as the others. The way the media portrayed the band didn't help either. Each of the Beatles was given a nickname. John was seen as the smart one. Paul was the cute one. George got labeled the quiet one. And Ringo was called the lucky one. That's how the world saw them, and those labels stuck. From 1964 to 1970, the Beatles had a #1 single in America roughly every 6 weeks and a #1 album every 3 weeks. They were the first pop group since Buddy Holly to release a full album of original songs with A Hard Day's Night in July 1964. But most of the attention was still focused on John and Paul. Their songwriting partnership was what fans and the press talked about. Even though George played a key role in shaping the band's sound and style, he was often overlooked. By 1965, the stress of being sidelined began to take a toll on George. That same year, he started to explore new things. He became interested in Indian music and had his first experience with LSD. In March, the Beatles met Swami Vishnu Devananda and were given a copy of the complete illustrated book of yoga. Later that summer, during a visit to Elvis Presley's home, George heard more about yoga, although at that point, he wasn't fully drawn to it. But by the end of 1966, things changed. George started reading books by Swami Vivekananda and Paramahansa Yogananda more seriously. He was no longer just curious. He was searching for something deeper and more meaningful. In the summer of 1967, George and John spent long hours in Greece, chanting the Hare Krishna mantra while on LSD. By August, all 4 Beatles went to see Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which led to their famous journey to Rishikesh, India, in 1968. For George, this wasn't just a phase. It was a way to cope with the pressure and the growing feeling of being invisible within the group. His spiritual journey became a source of peace and strength in a band where he often felt left out. In April 1965, while filming the movie Help at Twickenham Studios, George had an experience that would shift everything for him. That moment marked the beginning of his deeper transformation, one that would shape the rest of his life, both inside and outside of music. During filming for the movie Help, there was a scene where Indian musicians were playing in the background. While the crew waited between takes, George Harisson noticed a sitar lying nearby. Out of curiosity, he picked it up. The sound it made was strange and unfamiliar to him, but something about it captured his attention. Around that same time, other British bands like the Yardbirds and the Kinks were starting to experiment with Indian-inspired sounds in their music. But George took it further than anyone else. While the rest of the Beatles were often getting high and goofing around during filming, George became deeply focused on the sitar. He wasn't just playing around. He was searching for a unique sound no one else had. The sitar would eventually become a signature part of his musical identity. A year later, in June 1966, George met the world-famous sitar player Ravi Shankar at the home of Iona Deva Ungadi. This wasn't just a polite meeting. It was the beginning of something life-changing. Within just 3 months, both George and Ravi had cleared their schedules to travel across India together for 6 weeks. Normally, Ravi Shankar didn't accept students so quickly. People usually had to wait years for that chance. But he saw something different in George. Shankar later said George asked endless questions and showed a real interest not just in Indian music, but also in its spiritual and religious traditions. At first, Ravi thought the sitar part George had played on Norwegian sounded unusual and a bit off. But as they spent more time together, he realized George wasn't treating Indian music as a gimmick. He was genuinely committed. Their connection felt almost like fate. George had actually recorded that sitar part for Norwegian back on October 12, 1965. It was a historic moment, the first time an Indian instrument was used in a Western pop song. He'd bought the sitar in London, on Oxford Street, from a music shop that had imported it from Kolkata. George said that when he sat down to play, the right notes came to him naturally, and they fit the song perfectly. That one moment ended up changing the future of rock music. Norwegian wood helped spark a trend that critics later called Raga rock. For a short time, many pop and rock bands started adding sitar and Indian-style sounds into their music. George's sitar from that session became iconic. Years later, it was sold at an auction for $62,500, with the bidding starting at $50,000. Interestingly, George had given it away during his honeymoon in Barbados to a friend of his wife, Pattie Boyd. But not everyone in the Beatles was happy about George's deepening connection to Indian music. In 1968, the entire band traveled to India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George went with the hope of focusing on his spiritual growth and finding inner peace. Paul McCartney, however, came with a different mindset. He wanted to use the time to write new songs, which would later become part of the White Album. This difference in priorities led to tension between them. Paul later admitted that George had gotten upset with him during the trip. George scolded him, saying, "We're not here to do the next album, we're here to meditate." That moment clearly showed how different their views were. Paul was always thinking about the next project and working non-stop. George, on the other hand, waited for inspiration and wanted to connect with something deeper. Paul saw George's spiritual journey as a distraction or even a bit foolish. But George felt that Paul didn't understand what truly mattered in life. Even though the world called George the quiet Beatle, he had been holding back frustration for years. In 1966, he finally got a real chance to shine. On the Revolver album, he was allowed to contribute 3 full songs, more than ever before. His song Taxman actually opened the entire album, followed by Love You Too and I Want to Tell You. This was a huge moment for George. Up until then, he'd barely been given space to share his music. But just as he was beginning to find his voice, he faced pushback again. Later that same year, when the band started work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, George brought in a new song he had written called Only a Northern Song. What happened next would show how hard it was for him to be taken seriously, even after everything he had done. George Harrison once brought a song to the Beatles called Only a Northern Song. It was a quiet criticism of how songwriting credits and money were handled in the band. Instead of supporting him, Lennon and McCartney rejected the song and pushed to give George just one track on the Sgt. Pepper's album. Paul later claimed that George didn't seem very interested during those sessions. But that wasn't the truth. George wasn't uninterested. He was being shut out. The whole experience left George feeling frustrated and bored. He later described the Sgt. Pepper's album process as dull and isolating. For his one song on the album, Within You Without You, he ended up recording it completely alone. No John, no Paul, no Ringo, just George and a group of Indian musicians. Even when the song was finished and producer George Martin added strings, the rest of the band still didn't show up to help or even listen. It became the first Beatles song recorded entirely without participation from the other Beatles. Ironically, Lennon later said it was one of George's best songs, but at the time, he hadn't cared enough to be involved. Paul's attitude made things worse. He often made fun of George's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality. While George was studying Hinduism, reading Vedic scriptures, and learning to play the sitar, Paul would roll his eyes, make sarcastic jokes, or walk out of the room during George's sessions. George once said they didn't even try to understand what he was exploring. It wasn't just about music for him anymore. It had become spiritual. And yet, the others treated it like a joke. That hurt deeply. Many people believed the Beatles worked as a team or a democracy, but that was never really true. Lennon and McCartney controlled nearly everything. George was usually allowed only 1 or 2 songs per album, while the rest were filled with John and Paul's work. Even when George wrote stronger songs, they were often rejected. He didn't own his music publishing like Lennon and McCartney did, and he earned less money and received less credit. Bob Dylan once said, George had to fight to get anything on the records. And he was right. George wasn't treated as an equal. He was more like a junior partner. By 1967, George had written many songs, but the others wouldn't even listen to them. One of those songs was All Things Must Pass. He brought it to the Let It Be sessions, but Lennon and McCartney dismissed it, saying it didn't fit. That entire session was tense and uncomfortable. At one point, George became so fed up, he gave the song to their friend Billy Preston, just to get it away from the Beatles. Later, George released it on his own, and it became a classic. The same thing happened with My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity? Even a song called Not Guilty, which the band tried to record over 100 times, was eventually abandoned. When those songs finally came out on George's solo records, they proved he had been right all along. The final straw came on January 10, 1969. The Beatles were rehearsing Get Back at Twickenham Studios. Cameras were filming. Paul kept picking apart the way George played his guitar. It wasn't anything new. George had been dealing with it for years, but something in him finally broke. He stood up, said he was done, and walked out without making a big scene. That night, in his diary, he simply wrote that he went home and recorded a new song. Then he noted what he had for dinner: 8 chips. That's how quietly he handled it. Just 4 days earlier, the cameras had captured a telling moment. Paul was once again telling George how to play. George responded in a calm, tired voice, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." It wasn't an angry outburst, it was resignation. And that's what made it so powerful. You could see how much he had held in over the years. That very night, after walking out of the studio, George went home and wrote a new song called Wah Wah. The title had a double meaning. It was the name of a guitar sound effect, but it also meant headache. That's what the band had become for him, a constant headache. George recorded Wah Wah for his solo album, and it was bold, sharp, and confident. When he returned to the Beatles 5 days after walking out, he didn't even bother offering them the song. Instead, he gave them I Me Mine. That choice meant something. George had decided to keep his best songs for himself from then on. Things at home weren't any better. His wife, Pattie Boyd, said George would come home from the studio angry and exhausted. They fought constantly. She saw how the band was tearing him apart. George barely spoke to Paul, and Pattie said he didn't even like Paul's personality. George was trying to find peace through meditation and spirituality, but the stress from the Beatles made that almost impossible. When George finally agreed to return to the band, he did it under strict conditions. He forced them to move recording sessions from the cold, uncomfortable Twickenham studios to Apple Studios. He also cancelled the live TV concert they had planned. Most importantly, he demanded that they give him more chances to contribute his songs. The band agreed, but reluctantly. It was humiliating for George. At one point, John even joked that they'd just call Eric Clapton if George didn't come back. That joke cut deep. Still, George returned because part of him still cared. But nothing really changed. The damage had already been done. One of the most painful memories for George came during the recording of Hey Jude. He had tried to add a guitar riff after Paul's vocal line, but Paul shut him down. He told George it didn't fit. George didn't argue, he just stayed quiet. Later, Paul admitted it had been disrespectful. He called George one of the greats, but still said he had to ask him to back off. That was the level of control Paul had, and how far George had been pushed aside. Then there was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Paul loved the song, but the others hated it. Still, they spent 4 days recording it, doing 16 takes on the first day alone. John didn't even show up to the sessions. Ringo called it the worst recording experience of his life. George thought the song was silly and pointless, but they did it anyway, just because Paul insisted. Finally, in late 1969, George had a real win. His song Something was released as a double A-side single with Lennon's Come Together. For the first time, George was given equal billing alongside Lennon and McCartney. When asked about it, he simply said, "Big deal, It was a huge achievement. Something reached #1 in the US, and even Lennon later said it was the best track on Abbey Road. But it had taken far too long for George to be taken seriously. He had been writing songs of that quality for years, but the others hadn't bothered to listen. On his solo album All Things Must Pass, George included a track called Run of the Mill. It was a message aimed at Paul. The title was a play on words, but the lyrics were sharp and honest. George talked about the mess inside Apple Corps, Paul's controlling behavior, and how Paul kept blaming everyone else. The song was emotional, but it didn't hold back. By 1974, George was no longer keeping quiet. In an interview, he said Paul had ruined his confidence as a guitarist. He didn't even know if he was good or bad anymore. And it wasn't just George. Another musician from Paul's solo band had quit for the same reason. It wasn't just anger George felt, it was pain. He had spent years being told what to play, how to play, and when to play it. At the same time, George's personal life was also falling apart. His marriage to Pattie Boyd in 1966 had looked perfect from the outside. They had met on the set of A Hard Day's Night, and people thought she was his muse. But behind closed doors, things were breaking down. By 1970, George's best friend, Eric Clapton, was secretly in love with Pattie. He wrote her passionate letters and even wrote the song Layla to express his feelings. At first, Pattie thought one of the letters was from a fan. But when she showed it to George, they realized it was from Clapton, the man George often welcomed into their home. This love triangle lasted for years. George and Pattie eventually divorced in 1977. 2 years later, she married Clapton. That marriage also ended in heartbreak. Years later, Clapton's letters to Pattie were sold at auction for $3.6 million. Then came another shocking betrayal. George had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. He didn't even try to hide it. At a dinner party, he looked Ringo in the eye and said, "I'm in love with your wife." Ringo, trying to stay calm, said, "Better you than someone we don't know." But things escalated when Pattie caught George and Maureen in a locked bedroom at George's house. She shouted at them from outside the door. George laughed. When John Lennon heard about it later, he called the situation virtual incest. Both marriages collapsed in 1975. 2 Beatles families were destroyed by George's actions. What made all this even more surprising was George's public image. He often spoke about peace, spirituality, and enlightenment. But many people around him described a man who was also full of anger, jealousy, and desire. His second wife, Olivia, tried to defend him by saying George just loved women. Ringo was more blunt. He said George was a bag of beads and a bag of anger. George only dated supermodels. He cheated often. And even though he talked about seeking spiritual truth, he regularly fell into cocaine use and emotional outbursts. Friends said it was like dealing with 2 different people. George's drug use didn't stop after the Beatles' psychedelic phase. It continued for years. His first LSD trip happened in 1965, when a dentist secretly put it in his drink. That unexpected experience changed George forever, opening up a new side of him, but it also left deep scars. But that same experience with LSD also led George down a darker path. Over time, he developed serious dependencies. In the 1970s, he was smoking up to 4 packs of cigarettes a day and using cocaine regularly. Even though he was struggling with addiction himself, he still warned others, like Elton John, to avoid drugs. He could give advice, but he couldn't follow it. His own habits were out of control. George often spoke out against materialism, saying people should live simply and not get attached to money or possessions. But his own life told a different story. His home, Friar Park, wasn't just a house. It was a massive 120-room estate with beautifully maintained gardens. He drove expensive, exotic cars and often dated glamorous women the press called goddesses. He sang about letting go of ego, but he lived like a rock star. Even when he went to India to study spirituality, he didn't go like an ordinary traveler. He received special treatment everywhere he went. The title of his 1973 album, living in the material world, perfectly captured the struggle he was facing. He was caught between two lives, the spiritual one he wanted, and the celebrity life he had built. People began to call him a hypocrite. But just when many thought he was lost in contradictions, George surprised everyone with one of the greatest comebacks in music history. In 1970, George released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that became a huge success.